Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for this masterclass from the Chartered Institute of Information Security, or better known as CIISec. This masterclass will be focusing, as you can see, on ransomware and economic terrorism, and the style for this afternoon is going to be very conversational and discussion-led. So before we get started with the introductions, I'll just run you through our house rules. If you're a CIISec member and you've attended one of these before, you'll be familiar with this already, but if you're not, then welcome to CIISec. For these webinars, you will be kept on mute, but please do engage with our speakers through the Q&A. So at the top of your screen, you should have a Q&A box. Please open that and type questions through to us. Do post your comments into the chat. Any discussion points, we'll also be looking in there. Say hello, but ultimately, please enjoy today's session. If you have any problems at all, then please do email us at support@ciisec.org, and another member of our team should be able to help you out with any issues that you have. There will also be a number of polls this afternoon as well, so you should see those launch up on your screen once they have been launched. We'll keep those up for, say, 20 seconds or so, but as I said, really keen to have your thoughts and your opinions all the way throughout, so please do engage with us. For anyone who's joined a little bit later, then today's session is on ransomware and economic terrorism. And I'm going to hand over to our host today, who is Professor Steve Fennell, one of our CIISec board directors. Within CIISec, Steve focuses on academic engagement and oversees our academic partnership programme. And outside of CIISec, or alongside his role within CIISec, Steve is also a professor of cybersecurity at the University of Nottingham. So over to you, Steve, to introduce our speakers.
Thanks very much, Sophie, and good afternoon, good day to everybody. Thank you for joining us. So yeah, as Sophie mentioned, I'm just a moderator for this session. The people doing the heavy lifting are the other folks that you can see on the screen. So I shall now introduce each of them by reading through their bios for you, so you can understand the expertise that's coming to us. And then once I've done that, I'll hand over to each of them to give us a brief opening statement with their position perspective on the topic before we move over into the more interactive part of things. So from the panel, in the order I've got them on the screen here. So firstly, Ian Whitehurst is a barrister specialising in criminal and regulatory law with a particular emphasis on serious organised crime, financial crime, confiscation and cyber-related offending. He's ranked in the leading professional directories and is a guest lecturer at several universities in England, Ireland and the US. Most recently, Ian was appointed as an adjunct professor at Chicago-Kent's Law School, and he started teaching a cybercrime course there as of January of this year. Second on my list is Mark Popkowitz, a lawyer with a background in US federal legislative and administrative policy and a former director of the Legal Innovation Center at Ulster University. He's an adjunct professor of clinical law at Brooklyn Law School and has also served as an adjunct fellow at Washington, D.C. think tank Tech Freedom. And last but by no means least is Adam Bushek, an international trade compliance attorney based in Washington, D.C. with over 10 years experience in ethics and compliance investigations. His expertise includes export controls, compliance, anti-corruption, economic sanctions, civil and criminal investigations, and last but not least, cyber security. He currently serves in the Compliance and Civil Enforcement Division of the Office of Defense Trade Controls Compliance at the US Department of State and is a professor of scholarly writing at George Washington University Law School. Now, please note, after all of that Adam, while he works at the Department of State, he's offering his contributions today in a personal capacity. So I'll say that to save him having to say it. And so that's the panel. That's the expertise that we're going to be drawing upon today, so quite considerable, as you can hopefully already see. But to prove it yet further, what I'm now going to do, as I say, is pass to each of them to give us their opening perspective on our topic, and then we'll move into bits that you, as an audience, can interact with. So first of all, let's go to Mark.
So hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm thrilled to be speaking with everybody today, and I'm very much looking forward to this panel. Now, one of the things I'll say to open up is that ransomware and economic terrorism aren't the things that are particularly new, but the rate at which we are seeing them is increasing. And one of the things that we are seeing now as a trend isn't just individuals or small businesses being targeted, but government agencies, municipalities, businesses and sectors that can affect a large swath of the economy are being targeted. And while the initial approach may have been targeting small groups or individuals for monetary gain, we are now seeing the increasing use of things like ransomware and economic terrorism by state or state affiliated actors as a form of asymmetric warfare. And it's my opinion that these things are only going to increase as the types of technology that are used to deploy these types of malware and the way that people are realizing that they can capitalize and make a lot of money or achieve goals of economic disruption increase. I think that we will continue to see this rise. And I think that a lot of governments and agencies are struggling with a legal and regulatory framework in order to figure out how to address it.
Thanks, Mark. Ian, how about your thoughts?
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone. Following on from Mark's introductory remarks, I agree, ransomware economic terrorism is only going to increase. My interest is how we combat that, whether that's through civil or criminal litigation, and how that litigation is deployed against private actors, but also potentially against state actors. And also the great challenge for the lawyers involved in this area is the extra-jurisdictional issues which arise from the deployment of cybercrime, ransomware, and economic terrorism. Whether thought ought to be given to establishing an international cybercrime court to deal with issues between states and private actors. So that's my particular interest and focus, and also trying to, from a practical scenario, think of solutions to the potentially endemic problems which are going to arise in the next few years.
Thank you, Ian. And last but not least, Adam, your thoughts, please.
Thank you. So I'm viewing it from a U.S. government perspective primarily, and what was usually or traditionally viewed ransomware as perhaps an evolution of blackmail and extortion that was perhaps best handled by state and local officials, but in the last few years come viewed as a national security matter that is best handled on a federal level. And these tools that maybe had traditionally been used for state actors are now being used in a sort of economic sanctions standpoint or a defense trade control compliance perspective, are now being used towards ransomware actors as well, both state actors as well as private actors.
Okay, thank you. So, audience, we've heard from the three panelists in terms of their perspective, where they're coming at it from. Before we go into some more specific questions to them, let's give a couple of questions to you in the polls, so that basically you don't walk away from it today thinking, well, nobody asked our opinion on anything. We're going to ask your opinion straight away. And the first question I'd like to ask you, our first poll, if we can get it launched, is around the question of whether you are worried about ransomware. So there we are. Hopefully it's popped up for you as well. Simple yes or no. Are you worried about ransomware? And we've got, how many people have we got? 39 attendees, I think we've got, so we should get some sense of a result here. It says on my screen, the hosts and panelists can't vote, so we're not allowed to have an opinion. Well, you'll get to hear the panel's opinion as we go anyway. So guess we all are worried about ransomware, otherwise we wouldn't be talking about it. But I'm just talking now to give you the opportunity to, there we go, hopefully now we have some results. And well, perhaps unsurprisingly, I guess, given that you've turned out for the session today, we have the vast majority of people indicating that they are worried about ransomware. I'm not sure, can everybody else see the poll results, or is it just me? So we've got, just in case you can't see it, 90% saying worried about it and 10% not worried. So that's nice that the 10% are feeling safe and confident. Maybe it's because you know you're well protected. We can find out about that later on. So let's get that one out the way. And immediately, so that again, you don't feel you've not been involved, ask you the next poll question. So whether you're worried about it, have you actually, to the best of your knowledge, have you or your organization experienced a ransomware attack? So is it something you're worried about with reason of having experienced it yourselves? There we go. And okay, so Luckily, let's say, the vast majority of people this time haven't actually had the first-hand practical experience of it, either individually or in their organization. So most people are not in the position of having had it happen, but nonetheless, it's almost the reverse of what we had before. So most people are worried, but most people haven't actually had the experience of it hitting them yet, perhaps. So, okay, that's our starting position as the audience. And I think that gives us a basis then to move into the first of our tangible questions to the panel. And do remember, while I'll be asking some questions, there is the opportunity for you to put stuff into the chat, and we'll come to those questions as well as the ones that I've already got on my list. So if you get fed up with me asking stuff, put something in the chat so you get your airtime as well. So, panel. We've seen a rise in malware attacks affecting governments and major economic sectors. So what are some of the recent things you've seen governments doing to actually combat this? And I'm going to come to Mark again first.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. It's a great question. And one of the things, I'll take a step back quickly and say that the US has what are called administrative agencies, and something that the audience might not be as familiar with. So while our Congress makes laws from time to time, there are areas where they realize they don't have expertise. So they will sometimes create administrative agencies via a statute, when give these agencies the right to kind of enforce and create regulations around a particular industry or sector. So we see this with our Department of Energy, which regulates the energy production sector. We see this with our Securities and Exchange Commission, which regulates certain types of stocks and equities and those sorts of things. And we also see this with our Federal Communications Commission, our Federal Trade Commission, et cetera. And one of the ways that these agencies make rules is to put out what's called a notice of proposed rulemaking, where they put out a big report and they explain the authority they have to pass rules over a certain sector. And then they say, here are the rules that we propose. Why am I giving you guys a crash course in US administrative law? Well, because our Securities and Exchange Commission recently put out a notice of proposed rulemaking on cyber rules related to certain types of funds and fund advisors. So there's clearly a concern from a US regulatory perspective when it comes to the disruption that types of cyber incidents and ransomware and malware can have on financial markets. We've also seen the creation within our Federal Bureau of Investigation, a new sort of national cryptocurrency enforcement team, which is going to be reaching across different agencies to look at cryptocurrency related kind of crimes, investigate them, whether it's things involving money laundering or ransomware. We've also begun to see more attempts at passing regulations and laws where you see different states introducing pieces of legislation and different federal legislators introducing legislation that would look at certain types of cyber, malware, and cryptocurrency related incidents. So I don't want to keep going on too long about this, but I'll say that I think that while we have begun to recognize this, there are still a lot of sort of hurdles, in a sense, in the way of getting actual legislation or actual regulations that will really be sort of fit for purpose when it comes to these types of attacks.
Thanks, Mark. Ian, what about your thoughts?
Remind me of the question again, please, Steve.
Okay, so we've seen a rise in malware attacks affecting governments and major economic sectors. What are some of the recent things you've seen governments doing to combat these attacks?
I think Mark has just illustrated how, in my opinion, advanced the US is compared to the UK. I mean, I'm aware through contacts in law enforcement that ransomware is quite, shall we say, active in the financial sector in particular. Examples were given to me recently in Northern Ireland where there are continual ransom attacks, banks paying them and not informing the law enforcement agencies, coming to them secondhand through intelligence. So from the UK perspective, although it has now entered the political zeitgeist, so to speak, about the issue of ransomware and the possibility of the attacks, at the moment, no specific organization has been, shall we say, given increased powers to deal with this. For example, if you were prosecuting a ransomware offense in this country, and as far as I'm aware, no ransomware offenses have been prosecuted in the UK, you would actually prosecute it under a Theft Act 1968 on the basis of it's akin to blackmail. So there are issues that, in effect, with the UK, although everybody is now aware of it, there's no specific agencies set up to deal with it. Agencies who may have it within their remit have far other more important things to deal with at the present moment in time. There's no specific legislation to deal with it. And as far as I'm aware, no criminal prosecutions have been pursued in relation to it. And I think it's interesting in relation to the regulatory side of things, which the SEC and the states are heavily involved in relation to regulation of financial markets, cryptocurrencies, etc. In the UK, there's been singular failures by the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, to even get to grips with how any purposeful regulation could be done of crypto, let alone consideration of how ransomware may well affect economic markets and financial markets. So unfortunately, I would say the UK are significantly behind the US. We are aware of it, but as yet, it seems to be being brushed under the carpet when other matters need to be dealt with. And also there's a lack of resources and funding and training, in effect, in my view, in the UK.
Actually, if I could quickly jump in for a moment here to say, one of the things that I think is also something that we should note is that it's difficult to get businesses and organizations to acknowledge sometimes when this has happened. As Ian mentioned, a lot of times these organizations get attacked and they decide to pay the ransom to retrieve access to their files or retrieve access to their systems, and for a number of reasons don't want to disclose it, whether it's to the public at large or to government. And so one of the challenges too, I think, that governments face is this idea that a lot of companies don't want to be known as a company who have been on the receiving end of one of these ransomware attacks, because it could affect their share price, it could affect a lot of other things. And now questions are beginning to emerge of whether or not these are the kinds of material events that might require notification to shareholders, for instance. And there's some interesting discussion around what types of things should be disclosed, what types of things might need to be done at a board level, what kind of documentation you might need in order to respond to one of these things. And I think that the regulators are going to have to walk a fine line between trying to make these sort of disclosures compulsory versus the extent to which companies might be permitted to just decide whether or not it's business as usual, this is something they're going to deal with internally.
And if I could just add to that, the other factor is that companies seem to be relying upon their insurance to, in effect, to bail them out if they pay it. I do not think that will continue. I think insurance companies will start to be more proactive in relation to ransomware demands. And you may well start to see the insurance market refusing to pay out or cover losses incurred by ransomware. There's going to be a revision of insurance policies. There's going to have to be stronger checks on due diligence on the firms themselves about what cybersecurity measures they have in place. So at the moment, firms are relying upon A, insurance, or B, an economic write-off situation. And Mark is quite right. They are reluctant to involve law enforcement for a variety of reasons, as Mark just mentioned, but also they are concerned about their systems and their operating capabilities being open to public scrutiny. If there is any other, shall we say, misconduct being done by the company, because I know from representing companies, they are loath to open their accounts and their systems to public scrutiny by a regulator or law enforcement. So those factors, I think, are going to be very much in play, and the insurance industry in this sector are going to have a significant impact upon how ransomware is dealt with by companies.
And I'm actually going to piggyback on both of you guys here. So Mark is correct that there's not a dedicated cybersecurity enforcement agency in the United States. But as some of these problems that Mark and Ian have discussed, in an attempt to solve some of those, there has been established a cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency, which, while it has no enforcement powers or mechanisms directly, it is designed to gather information, at least research and understand ransomware problems and develop best practices and provide guidance to private actors, private companies and individuals how to protect their systems from ransomware attacks. And in the absence of a direct primary enforcement agency, other government agencies have been using their existing authorities to try to fill in the gaps, if you will. So, for example, OFAC is a Department of Treasury agency that was established initially to enforce economic sanctions, more typically an idea of, like, say, North Korea or Iran, avoiding UN sanctions have been using its authority now to target, if not ransomware actors directly, but those that might facilitate the ransomware payments even. So for example, in 2018, they designated, which means that US companies or any companies using the US financial system cannot do business with these individuals. They designated Iranians who were involved in exchanging ransomware payments. And in September 2021, they actually listed a Russian virtual cryptocurrency exchange prohibiting US persons and others who were involved in the US financial system from doing business with that exchange. And to further encourage, well, I would say even as recently as 2019, the FBI kind of viewed victims of ransomware in a more ambivalent sort of attitude about paying those ransomware demands. Most recently now, actually in September 2021, OFAC now says that if you do not, if your payments are going to designated individuals, OFAC might take enforcement actions against you, even as a victim of the ransomware attack, if you were not using best practices and were not working with law enforcement or otherwise cooperative in trying to address the ransomware attack. So hiding it from law enforcement or not taking sort of safety measures in order to protect your systems beforehand, even if you are the victim of a ransomware attack, you might still be subject to enforcement by a government agency for paying that ransom, I should say.
Well, what you said, Adam, is something that's very interesting on the score of kind of setting what the standards are for minimum or de minimis cybersecurity protocol. There was a very little case law in the United States on this, but in the one of our appellate courts, the United States Court of Appeals, for I believe the Third Circuit back in, I think it was 2015, there was a case against Wyndham Hotel Corporation, Wyndham Worldwide, or whatever the name of the company was, the ones the hotels, because they had several really, really bad security practices. I mean, they had edge appliances with default logins and passwords. They had breaches and didn't change passwords. They didn't notify people of breaches. And everything they did was so bad, there was an enforcement action against them by our Federal Trade Commission. The hotel chain argued, well, hold on, there isn't a standard yet for cybersecurity that's been articulated. So we have an issue here. You can't hold us to some non-articulated standard that we can't conform to a standard that doesn't exist. And from my recollection, it's been years since I've read the case, but the court essentially said your security practices fall so far below the custom of what is expected in your industry that we don't even need to announce a standard for you to have fallen below it, because it is so far below what you would think the bare minimum that we would expect from a company in your sector. And it sounds like that sort of approach seems to be happening, that that OFAC, which is what the Office of Foreign Asset Control.
Correct.
That OFAC is basically looking and saying, well, what is the industry doing? And you need to kind of conform to industry standards. And this sort of goes to one of the questions that we've been asked, which is, why can't we make payment of ransomware illegal? And it sounds like you, without, I don't know if you saw the question from the audience, but it sounds as though it seems that in certain circumstances, to a certain extent, at least from a US perspective, we might be looking at doing something like that, depending on to whom the payment is or what the medium of payment might be.
I was going to come back to that question about payment, because that will chime off something that we'll do later on, just to blow the cover of it, one of the later poll questions. So we'll return to that one properly later. And also I'll pick up a couple of the others that have come in. Before we get to that, though, I want to just get a sense of how things are in terms of experience of prosecutions of people involved in this. So I'll come to Ian for a UK view and Adam for a US view. So to your knowledge, then, have there been many actual prosecutions of people involved in ransomware attacks?
As far as I'm aware, in the UK, there's been no prosecutions as yet for ransomware attacks. It was said at the beginning that ransomware is an evolution, in effect, of blackmail, and blackmail offences are quite rarely prosecuted in the UK in any event. Now we've evolved into cyber blackmail, i.e. ransomware. I suspect it will be very difficult to bring prosecutions at the present time for a variety of reasons. A, lack of resources, lack of skills in the prosecuting team. Also, most of the actors, whether they're private or state, are going to be outside our jurisdiction, and may well even be outside the jurisdiction of the EU, and therefore there are issues about enforceability. So on practical terms, as the law presently stands, and the operators in ransomware are mostly located, shall we say, outside of our jurisdictional remit, I suspect there will be few and far effective prosecutions as the law presently stands. I think that's why we will have to look, if this problem persists, I think it will in the short to medium term, that there are going to have to be alternative ways of, in effect, prosecuting stroke enforcement measures being deployed against operators who are active in ransomware. I think the situation may be slightly better in the US, and no doubt Adam can address that now, but in the UK, it's not looking good.
Go on, Adam, give us some optimism.
I wish I could. As Ian noted, perhaps the biggest problem here is that most of the time these actors are outside of the jurisdiction of the United States. So to the extent that they are based in Russia or China or Iran, you're just not going to get sort of government cooperation. That is, even if these actors are not acting on behalf of the government itself, which in some cases they very well may be, but even if they are simply private actors, you are unlikely to get the cooperation necessary to have a criminal enforcement against these individuals, which is part of the reason why you have OFAC and other sort of financial and trade agencies kind of working around the edges to try to make it, even if they cannot get the actors themselves, to make it so that crime doesn't pay, if you pardon the overused phrase, but to make it more difficult for them to actually get their payment, and the idea to discourage it that way, as well as to get the actors that they can, those that may not be outside the jurisdiction themselves, but people who are in the jurisdiction that might be facilitating these acts. One area that we have seen very, very recently in the U.S. is the one thing is that we do have jurisdiction over U.S. citizens, U.S. persons, really, which includes U.S. citizens as well as green card holders. And to the extent that they might be facilitating, if not ransomware, but hacking and other sort of cybersecurity issues, they have been prosecuted recently under defense trade statutes that prohibit U.S. persons from training or advising or teaching or instructing foreign persons in the use of information security systems, cryptological systems, without authorization from the U.S. government. So to the extent that U.S. persons are involved in any way in the ransomware attacks, they might be subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S. And I don't know of any ransomware specific cases at this point, but there are hacking and other sort of cybersecurity cases where that has come into play. And so that might potentially be an avenue going forward in ransomware cases.
I think, Adam, as well, recently there was, because of the oil pipeline ransomware attack, the FBI, I think you were telling us about this, deployed some, shall we say, measures against the cryptocurrency exchanges who were in effect, shall we say, holding the money which had been paid over. I think about a few million got recovered back by the FBI. Is that correct?
Yeah, or I mean, I wish I remember their names. I just know they're the Instagram influencers who had stolen a bunch of Bitcoins back in 2015 and had been slowly peeling it out over time. They were recently caught, and the FBI was able to seize the vast majority of those stolen cryptocurrencies that they had. So that is something that, is always, it's the easy part perhaps is the ransomware and getting the money. The more difficult part is how do you actually use the money? And so to the extent that that cannot be done all at once, to the extent that you have a wallet or your cryptocurrency is still publicly seen, I guess it's public knowledge, the FBI can target it and has seized that on multiple occasions now, have been able to do that.
Okay, let's pick up a couple of questions from the chat, if we may. So I think this one goes back to a comment that Ian made earlier about the gap. So is the review of the Computer Misuse Act in the UK going to plug the gaps around prosecution that have been mentioned for ransomware? What do we think on that one? Yes, Ian, for that.
There is the Computer Misuse Act. It's used rarely, in the sense of prosecutions are not forthcoming, and the powers are quite limited under it, depending on which section you're prosecuted under. The maximum sentence is either 2 years or 5 years. I don't know, and I go back not necessarily to the legislation, but to basically the investigation techniques for somebody to be able to identify, locate, and then bring back into the jurisdiction people deploying ransomware. And that's why I think we need to look more on an extra jurisdictional basis of how Western societies are going to combat this situation, because the existing procedures and statutes, shall we say, are probably going to be insufficient. And that's a problem with a lot of cyber offending, in my view. The tech is in front of the law, and the law isn't able to catch up. And I think what we've got to consider as lawmakers, cyber experts, and lawyers is how we can develop a system where the legislation and, in effect, the political will can catch up with the tech. Because if we don't, we're going to end up in a very difficult position.
Steve, I warned you that there was a risk that I would do this, and so please cut me off if this gets too boring and legalistic.
Yeah, I'll catch you out.
But,
yeah, go on.
Well, but I look to some of the interesting sort of almost linguistic components of this idea of, you know, the way the internet, that initially it was surfing the web, and that we talked about people who kind of stole things or misused copyrighted material as pirates. And there are, to my mind, a lot of parallels between early transportation and maritime law and admiralty and the idea of how we govern the internet. Because in the 18th century, the only time where you would have an issue as to which laws would apply would be in an admiralty context. I mean, if you were somebody who was English and you were in France, you know, you would be governed by the laws of where you were physically. We call it the lex loci approach. But if you were in a transportation or maritime case, you could have a French ship with an Italian captain carrying German goods bound for a Brazilian port. And it could collide with the ship with everybody else in all kinds of other countries on the high seas. And so how do you apply the laws? You have to have kind of an international agreement is saying, well, there's a certain space where no country governs, and there are certain rules that we're going to need to accept apply in that space. So it seems to me that from a cyber context, you know, in order to rob a bank in London, you used to have to be in London. Now you could be somewhere in some of the countries you've mentioned. You know, you could be in the United States and rob a bank in London and transfer the money to Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. So I think that the old approach, I shouldn't call it the old approach, I say the current approach from a legal law enforcement perspective typically focuses on the physical place where a crime occurred and where the wrong happened from a kind of tortious perspective. But when it comes to the idea of the internet and the fact that we can affect change or affect action somewhere far away from where we are physically, jurisdictionally, from a legal perspective, I think it creates fascinating questions. And I think that we're beginning to see how national actors, how states are puzzling through these. And I think it's very interesting, very exciting, but can also be very disheartening because the law is a slow, kind of backwards peering approach, has a very slow and backwards peering approach.
Yeah, and this has tended to apply, of course, in more contexts than just ransomware. So I think let's pick up one of the other questions that's directly off what we've said so far, which is, what does the panel think about the incorporation of NIST or ISO standards as a bare minimum requirement, I guess? So it seems like there are many things in place that could be used, but no actual enforcement. So should there be more of a, I guess, a legal requirement for organizations to adopt baseline provisions?
I guess I'll take a first go at this, but to say that, you know, there is precedent for governments requiring a standard set out by some other standards body organization, like the generally accepted accounting principles put out by FASB is something that a lot of financial institutions and financial regulators now require. So I can't, you know, speak to the specifically what the NIST or ISO standards are. I'm not super familiar with them on a granular level. but I would say that it would not be unprecedented, at least in the United States, for an agency to say, here's a standard setting body, here are their standards, we expect you to apply them.
Anybody else fancy a view on that one? Adam, you look like you're.
Well, I'll add in and say that your Mark is absolutely correct, that there is a history of that. I'll say that trying not to get too down into the weeds as far as trade compliance, but generally what is called technical data involving not necessarily a item itself, but rather information about how to design that item, how to use that item, how to repair that item, sort of ancillary information is called technical data. It's oftentimes intangible, virtual, and it used to be that any export of technical data, say, for example, in a cloud storage system, would require authorization as an export. But because of the need that companies had for cloud storage, we actually introduced a new rule called the encryption rule, allowing unclassified technical data. You still cannot export classified technical data, but unclassified technical data can be exported, if you will, or is considered not to be an export if it is encrypted to NIST standards and meets various other requirements that still cannot be exported to countries like China or Russia. But if you wanted to back it up to a server in Germany, say, or in the UK, as long as it is encrypted to these outside standards and is not unencrypted at any point, we no longer require authorization for that. And so we do make references to other outside standards as part of that.
Okay, thank you. So there's an anonymous comment in the chat, which I should just read so we get it in the recording. So there was an article in a newspaper, which I will also leave anonymous, yesterday saying that our investigation capabilities are a Betamax standard in a blockchain world. And the poster posted it anonymously because they didn't want to admit to reading the newspaper that I shall also leave anonymous in the recording version of it. So I thought we'd just get that in there. So yeah, the sort of, I suppose this issue of our investigative capabilities being behind where they should be, being flagged more widely than what we're just saying in this panel. Okay, so let's move us to the next poll to get the rest of the audience interacting with things. I know we've got some other questions still to pick up from the Q&A box, but poll 3, do you feel protected against ransomware? So we've established people are worried about it. We've established that not many people have directly experienced it. Are you protected? Are you feeling protected? And so we'll leave the poll question up for just a little bit longer this time, because I think last time people were still having a bit of a challenge getting there. So we'll wait and see what you all think of that. Okay, I would hope we've got enough time now for people to determine whether they feel protected or not. And click one of the buttons, there we go. So, okay, so a bit more of a split on this one. And the slight majority feeling not protected against ransomware. And so that's interesting, I think. So it sort of picks up, I guess, that issue of feeling worried about it that we had earlier on. And okay, I suppose for the 39% that felt protected, that's very good. But for the others, well, let's see what more we can do in terms of protecting. So moving us on in terms of the next question I want to ask, and I will come back to the questions that I can still see in the Q&A, so don't think I'm ignoring or forgetting you. But to the panel, what are some of the ransomware attacks that should have been recognized as harbingers of things to come? So we've seen things happening. What do we think about that? And I'm going to start this time with Mark.
Well, I think it's a great question, because a lot of times these things might not be national news, partially because, or international news, because I think if they're so new, a lot of the news agencies, the journalists might not recognize that this is an evolving trend. I mean, I'm sure many of us remember the WannaCry ransomware attack. That was one of the first ones that sort of hit these national, international headlines because of its scope and because of its size. And recently the United States, we've seen the Colonial Pipeline, which was a petrol pipeline that served a lot of the southeastern United States, that caused a lot of concern and fear and huge lines at petrol stations. And so, I mean, I think that if you're looking at the scope of these types of attacks, WannaCry is something kind of global in scale. This Colonial Pipeline is more regional, but hitting the news. It makes me wonder about the kinds of attacks that we have not heard about that affected private actors where they did not want to disclose it. We've seen the NHS, I believe, in some capacity, did have a ransomware attack in one of its regional places. I believe this was either in Northern Ireland or the Republic of Ireland. I don't quite recall the specifics. And then there's also one in the United States that affected a large commercial meat packing organization that affected the price of mince in the United States and beef in a very significant way. So I only think that we are going to see an increasing number of these types of attacks. We are so dependent on, for instance, a few large cloud services providers globally, that if one of them falls victim to some kind of ransomware attack, we've already seen DDoS attacks knocking off major services. And I think that if something can be subject to sort of a DDoS attack, I don't understand to what kind of thing a ransomware attack might have. You know, a DDoS attack might knock it offline for a few hours. I think a ransomware attack could make something inaccessible almost indefinitely. So yeah, so to go back to the original question, I think WannaCry was sort of the really, really, really big wake-up call, I think, that when it came to ransomware, that I think a lot of people slept through.
Ian, any thoughts on it?
I think the problem with ransomware is a lot of people don't want to admit that they've been subjected to it, to be honest. One case which I was aware of, and I don't know if it would necessarily come within the parameters of a formal ransomware attack, but at least a cyber attack. And it's not well known, but it is in the public record that the Police Federation in the UK were hacked and police officers' personal details were leaked as a result of that hack. And in effect, there, for understandable reasons, there were considerable concerns about security implications. Because obviously police officers' names, dates of births, and critically addresses were in the possession of criminals, which could then be disseminated, sold, or whatever. And it turned out the Police Federation was hacked, I think, in total on 3 occasions, with various data extractions across various areas of their activity. And I think that's possibly a sign which Mark touched upon at the beginning in his opening remarks, that ransomware and its evolution into cyber warfare, or in effect attacking the fundamental principles of the state underlying it, are very real and very strong possibilities which are going to occur. Because if a major law enforcement agency was hacked and data extracted and not known particularly outside of a small circle, and that was a few years ago, then of course that is a sign of how things are going to come and to develop. And that warning was there. And in effect, that warning wasn't probably paid very much attention to by not only police, but also other law enforcement agencies. As far as I'm aware, no prosecutions have arisen from that. And that was, like I say, 2 or 3 years ago. So I use that as an example because I think it's an indication of how ransomware will evolve and is evolving. And it is going to become a risk to infrastructure, public bodies, and also inevitably moving into the warfare field. And I think Mark's opening remarks are very pertinent, especially bearing in mind what's going on in the world at the present moment in time.
Indeed. Adam, any thoughts on this particular one?
You know, I'm going to go ahead and just defer to Mark and Ian. I think they covered the topic well.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. There is another question in the chat that I want to come back to before we jump to another poll. I'm sort of conscious of our overall time, but there's a question: do we think there will be one standard that rises above the others? So this is going back to our question about NIST and ISO, etc. So particularly, NIST seems to be gaining traction. So will it replace ISO 27000? So the ISO 27000 Information Security Standard series there. Any thoughts from anybody on that one? Is there one standard to rule them all?
I think the standard which will rule them all will be the standard which the insurance industry says it should be applied. Doesn't care whatever it is. money will talk, and the standard they want and they apply across their contractual arrangements is going to be the standard. So that's why I think insurers are key players in this area at the present moment in time. Taking aside law enforcement and state activity, it will be the guys who pay the bill will set the standard. Whatever that standard is going to be their call, I would have thought. It's not going to be a low standard, put it that way, is it?
So a case of watch this space. Because we probably won't like it.
Yeah, exactly. It'll benefit the insurers and not businesses. And that's what people are going to have to be aware of, that standards are going to increase and they're going to have to for compliance. I don't know what Mark and Adam think from an American perspective, but I think following simple insurance policies, the insurer's approach to minimizing risk, that's what they're going to do.
Yeah, you have much more experience in this field than I, Ian, and I defer to your expertise. But kind of what I've been hearing is essentially exactly what you're saying, that from a normative perspective, the insurance companies will decide what they're willing to set for a level of coverage based on the standards applied within an organization. So if a company wants maximum protection, they'll adhere to whatever the standard the insurance company says. And so then the industry will coalesce around the standard or custom, which is a word we like to use in law. What is custom for your industry? And then the custom will be at quite a high standard based on what the insurance company set. I think that is absolutely how it's probably going to go.
Yeah, I would broadly agree. It's something that in the U.S., if as part of the federal rulemaking process, proposed rules have to be opened for public comment, which inevitably gives large companies and the vested interests an opportunity to lobby and to advocate for their positions. And I think ultimately any rule that would be passed, any standard that would be adopted would have to be one that was agreeable to big tech and to the money that is involved in it.
Okay, thank you. Right, now I'm very conscious, as I look at the clock, of the time we have remaining, or increasingly less of it. So let's go on to poll 4, and then we'll do some final sort of rounding up sort of questions. So poll 4, if we could, and this is all now about this issue of paying ransom. So if faced with a ransomware incident and the prospect of losing something important, and you could comfortably afford it, would you pay the ransom? So this is a question to you from your individual perspective as an audience member, because obviously we can't vote. Would you pay it? If you were going to lose something and you knew you could afford to pay it, would you? And we don't know who says what, so you can say what you truly believe you do, or you can say you don't know and you can sit on the fence. Do you have a strong view or a strong suspicion one way or the other about what you would do? So let's see. A bit more mixed. So half of the audience say definitely not, and a quarter pretty much say yes they would, and they don't know if they would. So I think it's sort of fair. I mean, certainly the guidance is not to pay, because it will only encourage the behavior, but we can see there that it's not that clear cut when it comes down to it, when you're facing the issue of you've lost something and you want to recover that, to get that back. And so that leads us, I think, quite nicely to the question that was posed very much earlier on in the chat, and we did briefly travel towards it when Mark made a comment about it, which is as phrasing the question, very simplistic, but why can't we make the payment of ransom illegal, removing the incentive, maybe replacing it with a financial reward to assist in recovering from such an attack? So more thoughts on that. Mark, you began with some thoughts in that respect. I don't know if you want to continue, or if Ian or Adam have got further thoughts to offer there.
Well, I think that Adam has some more experience in this space with respect to what has been being done. So I think I'll defer to Adam.
There you are, Adam. He's put you on the spot now. Let's wait a minute.
Mark, I would say that I'm not aware of any sort of movement to making a blanket rule of paying ransom to be illegal. I don't think that we've ever done that for what we said the more traditional version of this, of blackmail, extortion. It's something that there might be sort of ancillary crimes to the extent that you are embezzling to pay those extortion demands, or some sort of tax or money laundering issue. But I think that there would always be pushback, both from a optic standpoint, that you are talking about punishing the victims of a crime, as well as difficulties in defining these types of crimes. And so I think it'd be very difficult, just from a practical standpoint, to criminalize all ransomware, ransom payments. But it is something that, and I mentioned earlier, even though OFAC has instituted guidance, it's been the U.S. government standpoint that we strongly discourage the paying of ransom, in part because I think, as we all can at least sense, and if it has not been stated outright, that paying the ransom only encourages further ransomware attacks, either of you or of others. And that the way to fully stop ransomware attacks is to make it so that it does not pay. And so, while our guidance has gone from a standpoint of saying, look, this is ultimately a business decision, and I think all of us, it's easy for us to say, no, I wouldn't pay. But if you were in a position where you have a multi-million or multi-billion-dollar company and you're looking at major shareholder losses, it's a much different calculus. And so, even while OFAC has instituted these new rules that said they would potentially go after companies that might pay ransom, it even still leaves this sort of wiggle room that if you meet these standards, you have the appropriate policies and procedures in place to protect your systems, and you cooperate, and nevertheless are a victim of a ransomware attack, and then you cooperate afterwards, even then that's something that OFAC is unlikely to punish you for paying that ransom, kind of acknowledging that you can do everything right and do everything you can and still be put in kind of an impossible situation. And I think that sort of recognition that, it's easy to say in the abstract that you shouldn't pay, but that there might be a scenario where it's just, it's a no-win situation. And the fact that no-win situation is likely to be for a company or a government agency or other sort of entity that is going to be very sympathetic, if not powerful in its own right, makes it all the more likely that a blanket prohibition on ransom payments is unlikely to be instituted.
Well, it makes me wonder if we're going to move to something in law, what we call an affirmative defense. So for instance, if you, in the United States, if somebody breaks into your home and threatens you and you end up killing them in self-defense, you offer what's called an affirmative defense. You don't deny the crime. You say, yes, I killed the invader, but it was in self-defense to protect my life. So you're not saying that you didn't commit the act. You're saying I committed the act, but there were mitigating circumstances. Yeah. And these are typically circumstances that are by law or by the common law acceptable to the courts. So it makes me wonder too, if let's say you're a healthcare system and you get locked out of your medical equipment because of a ransomware attack, and people are going to die if you do not get access to the systems. So it makes me wonder, in those types of circumstances, you might have a, yes, we did pay the ransomware against this new fictitious law that we've said maybe could pass, but we did it because actual lives were at risk, and we felt this was the quickest way to get our, heart-lung machine or bypass system back up and running. Mm-hmm. So is that a similar approach in the UK, Ian, with this affirmative defense framework?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the points Adam and you just made. I think there is a reluctance to criminalize the victim. We don't criminalize the victim in a traditional blackmail extortion case where people pay the ransom or pay the fees required. I don't think it's going to be the way forward generally, because as you say, there are so many fact-specific scenarios which could arise, which would in effect justify either morally or, as you just said, legally, people paying the ransomware. So I don't think that's the way forward. I think what may well be the scenario taking place is that economic considerations i.e. through insurance, etc., come into play where there is a default policy that people don't pay the ransomware. And I think that may have a more, shall we say, significant impact on people's approaches than outlawing it itself, to be honest, because I think outlawing a scenario like this, you just can cover all the scenarios which may arise. Whereas insurance and economic factors may well restrict the situations more effectively where people are required to pay the ransomware. I mean, there's a great quote from English criminal law about blackmail, which is described as the murder of the soul. And I think that murder of the soul is now going to be translated into the murder of the financial soul of many companies. And companies have to realize on a long-term basis that paying ransomware never works, because they will just keep coming back and back and back. The situation is that repeat business, so to speak, hasn't yet kicked in, because it's still quite an emerging area of criminality. And I think that's what, on an educational basis, firms and companies have to be aware that if you pay them once, you'll end up paying them 4, 5, 6, 7 times. So it's a difficult legal, political, and economic issue, but definitely I wouldn't outlaw it. No, not for the time being at all.
Okay, folks, we're running really close to time now. There's a couple of questions that were posted in the chat, which Mark's kindly answered already in textful, but I'll read bits out just so that they become part of the recorded record. So one question was, how do we see ransomware attacks evolving in the future? And will IoT and our ever-connected world make ransomware have even more of an impact? And well, Mark's type response, I fully agree with, that IoT devices are another frontier. So it's basically more of a landscape against which we can be held to ransom. So this is not going to make the situation better, and the attackers will see more opportunities here. As Mark says in his response, it would depend on the type of device and the purpose it's meant to serve, and therefore what you can leverage out of people as a result. And another question, but I'll make it more of a comment for people to go and look at, was whether the panel had seen the CIISec approaches and technology, and whether that's a viable means of providing a minimum baseline. And there was a URL offered of www.ciisec.org. That's something that I think it would be useful for people to go and have a look at in their own time as well. We don't have time to discuss it now with the couple of minutes that just remain. But one thing I'd like to do is just go quickly round the panel for a no more than, let's say, 30 to 60-second response from each of you, because we'll run out of time, to sort of ask, what are some of the legal tools that are available to victims of ransomware? What could people look to? And so I'll come to Ian first, and then we'll go around Mark and Adam.
Traditionally, you can, if you are subject to ransomware, what you should do is inform the police, inform your insurers on a criminal perspective. How effective that will be, questionable. Civil approach, again, the big difficulty at the moment is, as Adam alluded to, most of these actors who are doing ransomware are based overseas and their identities are not known. So serving proceedings in a civil pursuit or in an injunction is going to be virtually nearly impossible. So I hate to say it, but at the moment, the best way to defend ransomware is to ensure your cyber security is top notch, because your legal options are limited, to say the least.
Somebody else make it better for us.
Yeah.
Basically. Adam.
And this is where, of course, the American lawyer says this is not legal advice. But I agree with everything that Ian has said, that at the end of the day, from a US perspective, we do have some statutes in place that don't necessarily specifically cover ransomware. There's our Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. There's our Wiretap Act if certain types of communications are being intercepted. There are some pieces of legislation like the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015, which does encourage the sharing of real-time threat indicators with certain government agencies. But largely at this point in time, while private businesses and individuals are encouraged to consult with or notify law enforcement, it isn't compulsory, and I think it would be very circumstantial.
Yeah, I will basically agree with everything that Ian said, and just double down and encourage going to law enforcement. It's something that, while yes, it's unlikely that you will get a recovery, it is something, though, that law enforcement agencies have a little bit longer term view of this. So it's something that, while you and your company may have moved on, rebuilt your systems, years down the road, that the law enforcement agencies will maybe continue to be investigating. They might be developing new tools. So it may be something that justice may take a long time, but it's really the only, I don't even want to say realistic, but really the only option perhaps that you have is reporting to the criminal authority, law enforcement authorities.
Okay, so folks, time is very much against us. We have now reached the limits of our slot. I mean, basically what we've seen is this is a significant issue. We're concerned about it, and really we need to be proactive in taking the steps to protect against it, because while there are routes for some level of legal recourse, it's not going to prevent the problem from occurring in the first place, and we're far better protected than not. Look, I'd like to thank the panel very much indeed for their inputs into all of this, with a wide range of questions, and thank you to the audience as well for the various things that you posed. We have got, the panel and I, an article coming up relatively soon with SC Magazine on the rise of ransomware, so a plug for us. Please do look out for that. And well, thanks to all for engaging with this, and Ian, Mark and Adam for sparing your time and offering us your expertise. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.